Gerri. I apologize to our witnesses for this 40-minute delay, and I propose to colleagues that we give some extension so that they make some considerable effort to be here, and I think we should honor their effort to be here and tell us what they are concerned about with respect to this systemic racism in policing in Canada study. So with that, I will also mention to colleagues that there is a subcommittee report to be presented, and I'll propose doing that towards the end of the meeting. And with that, I will invite Professor Roach, Professor, Faculty of Law, University of Toronto, to speak, along with Melanie Omeniho, President of the Women of the Métis Nation. And I'll just ask them to speak for 7 minutes in the order in which they're listed on the notice of meeting. So with that, Professor Roach, you have 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKay, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to make 7 concrete proposals to address systemic racism in policing. Number 1, collect and publicize race-based data. Although we know that the problem of systemic racism has been with us for a long time, we need statistics to measure whether it is getting better or worse in terms of both those accused of crime and crime victims. The Rcmp especially should work with Statistics Canada to collect and publicize data. Second, Parliament should regulate police practices. Parliament has, in the last 30 years, largely left this to the courts. In the UK, Parliament proactively regulates police conduct, and that ties that to the collection of statistics. So in the UK, for example, you know each year how many stops and searches have been made by police officers and who has been subject to stop and search. Third, I would change the law of self-defense and use of force policies. Indigenous, racialized, and people with mental health issues are overrepresented among those killed and injured by the police. In 2012, Parliament liberalized the law of self-defense so that on paper, it is broader than Section 25 relating to police use of force. Parliament should make clear that reasonable self-defense cannot be based on racist fears, even if genuinely and subjectively held. We also need to revisit not only police use of force, but tactics and de-escalation. 4, we should link policing with other social services and also make self-administered Indigenous police agencies a priority and an essential service. We are asking the police to deal with intergenerational trauma, addictions, and mental health issues. They should be required to work with other public and community agencies with more expertise and less coercive force. The number of Indigenous police services, such police services need resources and the freedom to work with others in the community and hopefully to take over policing from the Rcmp, OPP, and the Sûreté. 5th, we must improve governance inside and outside of the Rcmp. The 7-person Yukon Police Council, which has 3 First Nations members and is chaired by the Deputy Minister of Justice, is a model that you should look at closely. The Rcmp, especially in its contract policing role, can no longer rely on top-down governance from a very busy Minister of Public Safety through to the Commissioner. For example, Surrey is gaining much more local control over policing by opting out of contract policing. We need to find a way governance of the Rcmp overall. The new advisory committee is there to handle corporate risk, not to provide citizen input. 6, we have to improve citizen complaints and review in general. As you know, the Rcmp's review body is underfunded and underpowered, as the ongoing travesty of not releasing the report on Rcmp's interaction with Colton Bushy's family illustrates. And I really hope it doesn't, the Rcmp's result is not released on a Friday afternoon or on a busy day. The RCMP Act needs a fundamental rethink. And if that is not possible, then the federal agency should get out of the way and let the provincial agencies assume responsibility over police complaints, as they have in many jurisdictions assumed jurisdiction over investigations. And then seventh and finally, and this is probably the biggest ask, is we need to abandon the paramilitary model of policing, which I believe is perhaps more entrenched in the RCMP than any other police force. And we need to move towards an educated professional model. Police officers are educated professionals, just like teachers, nurses, and yes, lawyers. And they require continuous learning, hiring, specialization, and easier license suspension. Right now, we have a quasi-criminal disciplinary process, and I fear the police are rightly educated professionals. They're paid as educated professionals, but they should also be subject to license suspension, just like teachers and lawyers are. Thank you very much.
Thank you. President Omeniho, you have 7 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. I represent the Métis Nation, which is one of the 3 distinct Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we have our own history, customs, laws, language, culture, and traditions. Métis women are a vibrant, strong, resilient, and resourceful, and are the backbone of the Métis Nation. La Femme Chipotepimsawak, which is the organization I represent, is the voice of Métis women in Canada and across the homeland, which is Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. And I'd like to remind the committee today that today is Métis, it's a Métis Day. It's the 135th anniversary since the hanging of Louis Riel, and it's a day we honor. So it's I'm honored to be here today to present to you on this issue. Discrimination is created and reinforced through government policies and practices. Canada has a long history of policies and practices that have institutionalized racism towards Métis women, girls, and gender diverse people. While the current government is working towards reconciliation, many discriminatory policies and practices still exist today and have not been addressed as yet. In 2001 to 2004, the Correctional Service of Canada released a series of research reports examining Métis men and women incarcerated in federal facilities in British Columbia and the Prairie region. As part of these studies, researchers surveyed that childhood and family experiences of offenders growing up. Most Métis respondents reported experiencing or witnessing violence and substance abuse. Most had experienced or witnessed violence in their homes growing up and in the community. Most had also experienced or witnessed substance abuse in their homes growing up. Most Métis respondents reported having family members involved in crime while they were growing up. Métis women continue to be one of the most at-risk groups in Canada for issues related to violence and continuing to experience these complex issues, nonetheless, which is facing discrimination with police services. For many Métis women, the circumstances leading to their involvement in the criminal justice system is the result of complex set of collective and individual life circumstances marked with systemic discrimination, violence, and poverty. Systemic racism in policing continues to exist because of the legislation, racism, and policing practices that fail to recognize the full impacts of the biases against Métis women. One of the police practices that directly targets Métis men and women is carding. It has been proven by a multitude of studies that this practice targets racialized and marginalized communities disproportionately. The issue goes beyond carding, though. The true reason is that Métis women are treated differently than other women within the system, and continually hear how Métis women were actually targeted in many instances by police. With interaction with policing, Métis women are seen as a blemish on our society rather than a vibrant contributor to their nation and to who they are in their families and communities. Police services in Canada refuse to recognize racial bias and racism as a problem in their practices and policies, and police are not required to record racial data in their reports, making it even harder and more difficult for Indigenous people and advocates to push for change within the policing practices. What is required is a complete re-education of the entire police system. This training must go beyond a tick box of cross-cultural training, but must cause the system and participants to fully examine their biases, develop a best practice protocol for their enforcement response to missing persons reports of Métis people, including steps that police should take upon receiving a missing persons report for any Métis person. Along with the 62 calls for Miskatawa in our Métis perspectives for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report, the National Inquiry had the following 3 recommendations specific to Métis people in policing. 1712, we call upon police services to build, police services to build partnerships with Métis communities, organizations, and people to ensure culturally safe access to police services. 1713, we call upon police services to engage in education about the unique history and needs of the Métis communities. 17.14, we call upon police services to establish better communication with police communities and populations through representative advisory boards and involve Métis communities and address their needs. Policing that builds trust with Métis communities, is versed in Métis culture, is responsive to the distinct needs of Métis individuals, and is able to protect and meet the vulnerable Métis victims, which is so badly needed. Métis-specific policing holds the potential to address underreporting, a particularly potent issue for Métis women, to protect Métis communities and to reduce Métis overrepresentation in crime and victimization.
President Omeniho, can you wind it up? We're close to 7 minutes, please. Thank you.
Yes. I just want to finish it off by advising that many of our women reported to us while we're working on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls profiles that many of them ended up being victims of police services as well. So they never felt safe accessing police when they were victims of violence themselves. So changing policing and how we do business is a very important part of what we want to see done. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. I don't wish to interrupt people in the middle of their presentation because they work very hard on the presentation, and it doesn't work, but we are challenged by time. So with that, I'm going to ask the questioning round begin. I have Ms. Stubbs, Mr. Anand-Sangari, Madame Michaud, and Mr. Harris, 6 minutes each. Madame Stubbs, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Thank you to both of the witnesses for being here. I certainly wish, and I'm sure that the other members agree, that we had more time with you. I note that in a joint article on June 17th, 2020, that you said, quote, RCMP independence should be defined in the RCMP Act. I just want to invite you to expand a little bit more on that and on the details. And also, I guess sort of attached to that is the Brown Report recommendation of the Independent Oversight and Complaints Review Commission independent from the RCMP commissioner and the minister. And just if you could also expand on the concept of that independence of the Oversight and Complaint Review Commission, why it's important, what the key components and the impact is.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Stubbs. Defining police independence, I think, is important because there's frankly a degree of, how can I put this nicely, reticence for a minister to send directives to the RCMP. And police independence has sometimes been overinflated to incorporate all kind of operational independence, where I think the minister really should take more responsibility and issue public directives. For research I'm doing right now, I actually have an access to information request in for all ministerial directives to the RCMP, and I have heard nothing for over 3 months. To me, all of these, minus any sensitive information, should be readily posted on the web. And so I would define political independence as, or police independence, as we don't want the minister saying, investigate Mr. X, don't investigate Mr. Y. Or charge, but really everything else, things like Mr. Big operations, which are a litigation magnet. I don't see any reason why the minister cannot say, well, from now on, we're not going to do them, or we're only going to do them in these ways. I believe in democratic policing. As for the Brown report, I think we need to think about not just oversight, and I've already said that the existing RCMP complaints body is under-resourced and underpowered. It has no power to impose any sort of remedy, and it has a budget that, frankly, most law faculties have, 3 or 4 times the budget that it has, and the people there are trying their best, but they're having to deal with or supervise complaints from coast to coast to coast. But I also think we need a real police board for the RCMP. I think society now is just more complex, and this idea that there's the minister here and the commissioner there, and then somehow it all works out with the provinces and the territories, I don't think is sufficient. I also think that we need to have the RCMP work with other parts of the federal government, health, Indigenous affairs, and so on, to take a more kind of whole of government approach to safety and security.
You have about 2 minutes, Madam.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate your comments, and I note also your previous recommendations about the importance of civilian oversight and the democratization of the RCMP, like you've touched on here. And I think it's just important in this context because I note that, the Prime Minister, the Public Safety Minister, the Justice Minister, other members of this government have said that there is systemic racism in the RCMP. That's an extremely serious concern. I happen to have a very close relative who has been a detachment assistant for more than 40 years. You can imagine, I know many frontline dedicated officers and support staff who are good, and they're extremely frustrated, and there are bad apples, as there are in every institution, and acts of racism must be stamped out, and individuals who are racist must face full consequences. But it seems to me that if the Prime Minister and these ministers have made this indictment, and it looks like might have pressured the RCMP commissioner into correcting or previous comments and saying the same thing, then where are the directives? Where is the concrete information and facts and instructions from the minister to offer concrete solutions? So I don't know if you want to expand on the importance of the transparency issue too, in terms of actually achieving outcomes and confidence in institutions among all Canadians.
That's
Yeah,
a very important question, but she's only giving you about 15 seconds to answer it. So if you could
Sorry.
be very brief, please.
sure. Look, the RCMP has a very difficult job, and hopefully when they eventually release the Bushy report, they will come out with a plan. But I mean, every institution has to deal with institutional racism. So I don't think this should be seen as an indictment of the RCMP in particular.
Thank you, Professor Roach, Ms. Stubbs, Mr. Ananzangri, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues. Thank you both for being here today. And I also want to acknowledge Louis Riel Day, this very important day in Canada. Professor Roach, I'm going to start with you, and hopefully I'll get some more time. With respect to addressing issues of systemic racism, can you give us some good examples of other police departments, agencies that have addressed it, and what concrete steps, apart from the 7 that you've identified, should the RCMP be taking?
Right. Well, I think it's very important both to empower racialized people within the RCMP so that there are support groups, I know, in Toronto Police Service, Ottawa Police Service, where groups of racialized police officers can not only mentor, but can also respond to problems that they have within the organization. So that's one thing. The second thing is I think we need to have consultative community committees, but we also need to realize that, speaking to 2 or 3 people in one community is never enough. And we need to have town hall meetings. And I think the commissioner needs to, in some cases, and I know she's very busy, she needs to listen. But she also needs to have people within various communities that she can have a continuing relationship with, but then can also take her to different communities in order to have a town hall. Policing has to be democratic. And the commissioner has to realize that. And as with any police chief, the police chief works for the board, or in this case, the commissioner works for the minister. And if it's not working out, then, as in all cases, it's maybe time to find someone who has a different vision.
So, Professor, just to pick up on the democratization of policing, I know you mentioned it a couple of times. So, an agency like the RCMP, goes from one end of the country to the other. How do you ensure that the needs of people in Surrey are addressed within a local context, as well as people in Halifax or Nova Scotia? Isn't it inherently difficult to be able to have both? And the broader question I'm putting forward, and I want you to address it as well, is this time for us or the RCMP to get out of contract policing altogether?
Well, I mean, I think that would be a huge step. I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And as you note, Surrey is coming up with its own police. But I think if you look at the Yukon Police Council, that's an example where within one territory, they have taken proactive democratic steps. If you look at the 2019 Ontario legislation, Community Safety and Policing Act, they have detachment boards, both for each OPP detachment and detachment boards for First Nations who are served by the Ontario Provincial Police. Now, when we have these detachment boards, we have to also train those citizens who are serving in a democratic capacity so that they're not completely dominated by the detachment coordinator. But I think we need something like that. And when I look at the RCMP Act, it is the least democratic policing act in Canada that I'm aware of. And I think that the Ontario Act is actually much better on the democracy front.
So between, in comparison, so let's look at the SIU, for example, and let's look at the Toronto Police Service Board. There are two essentially independent bodies that oversee, in some respect, the work of the Toronto Police. What mechanism do you think the RCMP needs? I know you've touched on some earlier, but in terms of the SIU portion, what do you think is required for investigation and charges to come forward when there's inappropriate or wrong behavior?
Right. Well, I mean, we obviously need some SIU type mechanism for those provinces that do not already have one. But my understanding is, say in Alberta, they have their own SIU and it handles the investigation. The problem, say in Nunavut, is if the RCMP shoots someone in Nunavut, which has happened quite so often, it's the Ottawa police that are investigating. But I would go back to the fact that I'm a criminal law professor, and although I think SIU is important, I also know that you have to give everyone the reasonable doubt about guilt. And that's why I talked about changing the self-defense laws, changing the use of force policies, because I actually think that that is even more important than simply having prosecutions, criminal prosecution, are warranted.
Thank you, Mr. Anand-Sangri. With that, we'll go on to Madame Michaud, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Roach, for being here. You talked about other examples, for example, the United Kingdom. And you said that you thought to fight systemic racism in our institutions, namely policing, we should proceed through a legislative approach, modifying legislation on use of force, and to stop the top-down approach. Could you talk to us a little bit more about how the minister could intervene with the Minister of Justice in this regard?
Thank you, Ms. Michaud. Unfortunately, I wasn't getting the translation in my ear, but I think I followed you, although I may embarrass myself, and I beg your pardon. But I do think that with a top-down sort of approach, I mean, when the Minister of Public Safety came to you very recently on the mandate letter, I'm pretty sure he came with the heads of 5 or 6 different organizations. He has a huge portfolio, and I worry that that is beyond the capacity of any one human being. And maybe we need a minister for the RCMP, or take it out of public safety and into some other ministry. So I think that this is a real problem. Is we have a mammoth ministry, and we have the RCMP, which itself 20,000 people, some issue even before you get into the issues with corrections and CBSA. And one of my concerns is that we're going to take the existing RCMP complaints and review body, which I think on its own admission is really struggling, and we're going to add CBSA to it. That's not going to necessarily make things better. There's only 2, I believe, commissioners on that body. So I think it is important to recognize that the federal government has a huge presence. Now, if the federal government starts moving out of contract policing, I think it also has to think about not simply recouping those funds, which are less, because the federal government is subsidizing contract policing a lot less. And I think with unionization in the RCMP, you're going to see more Surreys, although obviously COVID has thrown a spanner into the works. But if there is a withdrawal from contract policing, I would hope the federal government would use its spending power to incentivize all existing police forces to partner with other public agencies and other community agencies to less coercively and without discrimination, or with less discrimination, deliver essential policing services, which also involve, as my co-panelist has talked about, victims of crime, which is also another huge issue.
Merci.
Thank you. And before I ask my next question, I want to ensure that Mr. Roach has access to the English interpretation of what I'm saying in French. Is it working for you?
Sorry, I'm still not getting the translation.
There's a globe on the bottom. If you put that on English, you should be able to get translation. So between participants and reaction.
A globe. No,
Right.
I have a phone, and I have a plus and a minus, and I have a microphone cut. I don't have a globe. I'm very sorry.
At the bottom of your screen.
I'm afraid not. No. Sorry.
Is there an interpretation icon? There should be an interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen.
It goes mute, stop video, then in the middle it says participants, then next it says interpretation, and then restrictions, and then leave. Or across the bottom. Now you're on mute.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
It just doesn't seem to be present.
Well, that's a problem with being a professor. Okay. Well, we'll have to plow on. Excusez-moi, mesdames.
I'm very sorry, Ms. Michaud. Mr. Roach, are you going to be able to understand the question if I ask it in French? Absolutely, yes. Or at least I do hope so. Well, what you said about the minister's workload is very interesting, that it might be too big a workload to be able to be responsible for Rcmp and to do away with systemic racism. You talked about the importance of abandoning this paramilitary approach and to go more towards an educational approach. And during this study, you mentioned it might be a way to accompany policing in the field, especially to bring in people specialized in mental health or other specialists who could accompany some of the police officers. Do you think it's a good idea? And what should the federal government do in regard to financing, to be able to finance those programs or those additional presence of officers in the field?
As you noted, I do think we need a more flexible model. I was part of an expert panel commissioned by the Canadian Council of Academies on the future of policing. And we heard evidence really from around the world that policing needs to become much more specialized, so that what works for cybercrime does not necessarily work for 24/7. So the idea that everyone in the RCMP or all officers have to go through depot in Regina, I think is anachronistic. And I think that although there are financial challenges, as I believe your question alluded to, I actually think that if we have a more flexible workforce in the RCMP, this could actually result in savings. So this idea that everyone has to be a police officer for the majority of their working life, I think if we look at this in a 10, 20, 30-year horizon, this is not realistic. And one of my concerns is that, I recognize the Supreme Court has allowed the unionization of the RCMP, but I worry a little bit that this, as well as the paramilitary ethos and the idea that everyone has to go through Regina and kind of a boot camp in Regina, is going to make the RCMP a less nimble police force. Many municipal...
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I apologize. It's what I do best, apparently. And I'm going to address our time limitations once Mr. Harris is finished. With that, Mr. Harris, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses today. And first of all, I too, like Mr. Anansangri, would like to recognize the Louis Riel anniversary today and speak first of all to President Omeniho about the Métis Nation, the women of the Métis Nation. You talked about the importance of cultural understanding as in terms of policing, and I think I get that very much so. But now let me ask you if you have any opinion on whether or not there's any role for in Métis communities with for Indigenous police force, Métis involvement in the police force, or the kind of oversight that Dr. Roach was talking about at the local level. Is that something that you would think would be helpful? And if you have any views on it?
Actually, our governing members are actually looking at the possibility. It's a lot more challenging, though, than some of the First Nations community who have police services. The issue is that we don't have a captured audience in one particular spot. But I do know that the Métis Nation and the Métis Nation governments do want to look at the development of building some of their own justice processes. And we have many members who are involved and are Rcmp members. I know many of my friends and relatives over the years to try to change the institution became members of those police services. And I want to tell you, like, whether people like to hear it or not, they tell me some of the stories and stuff. Racism is embedded within that system. And it isn't about trying to say the whole system is corrupt. It's about us making it a better system, if that's the system of policing that we're going to be using. So I'd like to see at least a relationship between the various police services and the Métis Nation and the Métis Nation government if we're going to move forward. Because I think that without that, we're always going to be a victim of the service rather than being a part of increasing it and making it a strength-based place.
Thank you very much for those insights. Dr. Roach, I know we've got a lot on our plate to undertake a study of racism, systemic racism, that is, in policing in Canada. One of the focuses that you talked about was on the oversight of the RCMP. I see two aspects of that. Is there a room for a national board that's somewhere up there that does the same kind of role in terms of policy, as well as local oversight, as you suggested, maybe as a default position in communities where the RCMP are acting? Can both of those models exist together, and should they be both covered in legislation?
I think the answer to that, Mr. Harris, is yes. I mean, the Ontario legislation now is moving towards an advisory committee for the OPP, which is the OPP Central, as well as detachment boards and First Nations boards. And I think even more naturally that would fit in with the RCMP, which does a lot of national policing. So I would think a national board for the RCMP would deal with issues of both over and under policing that, say, Muslim Canadians struggle with, in part because of stereotypes associating them with terrorism, and in part because of hate crimes that are unfortunately aimed at Muslims. So I actually see the two interacting. But I also think it's important that the RCMP be less rigid and less paramilitary so that the local boards can actually have some power. Because obviously what's required for policing in the Yukon is very different from what's required for policing in.
It's very efficient. I see 175 reports still on the commissioner's desk, and that's not good for her, and it's not good for the people who are waiting to hear their complaints. Is there room for some mechanism like an automatic release of these reports after 2 months or 60 days or 90 days to clear the decks? Should that be the way to go, or do we need to revamp the system? Added to this, there's another agency, the Canadian Border Service Agency, with the legislation that was tabled before the prorogation. So that seems good to be going nowhere. And what can we recommend to fix it?
You have
Right.
approximately 30 seconds.
I think that a kind of drop dead date that allows the commission to release, but the whole idea is that the commissioner should absorb and learn the lessons from the report. The commission has done some very good work in terms of systemic. Maybe one way to go is to leave it as a systemic body, but allow the provinces, when necessary, to have their own complaints bodies.
Yeah, I mean, a second round of 4 minutes for the first two questioners and 1 minute for Madame Michaud and Ms. Harris. That'll finish off this panel. And I've had a request from Madame May for a question as well. I'm inclined not to allow it only because we are so far behind. So with that, the second round is the Conservative, 4 minutes, except I don't know who the Conservative questioner is.
Yeah, hi, Chair.
Okay,
I'll
Mark.
be,
Okay.
Yeah, great. Good to be joining you. And I do apologize. I missed the opening comments, Melanie and Lisa, because of the connection problems. But today, we're celebrating National Métis Week, and I had an opportunity to recognize Métis people, and also to thank those that are so involved in making a difference. And so, Melanie and Lisa, I do want to thank you for your personal contribution that you are making over the years. And we may be related. I'm Métis myself, and my roots are the Villeneuve, Lac Sainte-Anne, Saint-Albert area, and so Hirondelle and Cunningham. So I'm sure we're connected. There's no doubt about that. But just a few questions. First of all, have you seen what barriers do you see for Métis women taking up a career in law enforcement? Or do you even see barriers?
Actually, there are many barriers to Métis women going into law enforcement. I do have some very good friends and allies that are Métis women. And by the way, my grandfather's Cunningham. So, but no, I know that's an aside, but there are women within that system. As much as I'm telling you that there's racism in the system, we also know that there's a great deal of gender issues within that system and how women are treated and how it's managed. It's not an easy system, and you'd have to be awfully tough. So I think the barrier would be is how well received women are and how they're treated. This system is an old system, and it's based on principles that just are not in today's world when you're talking about things like feminism. So we need to change how it's looked at. Women are a bit, back in the days when Rcmp were started, and we have stories in the 1800s where Rcmp raped our women. So, I mean, this is nothing that just started now. This is something from many centuries ago already. So we need to start looking at a system that is not based on the fact that women have no value. Back then, women didn't even have a vote or a say. We have to change these systems now so that they're reflective of exactly what our future is going to be, so that all people are treated equal within that system. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. Do you, just building upon what you said, do you have any other thoughts or recommendations on what this committee should look for or ensure that's included in the First Nations Policing Act? Is there anything that we need to avoid?
Well, I believe that the thing that I would, and I'm not an expert on First Nations policing, but the thing that I would tell you most of all that I think that we need to avoid when we're looking at alternative policing is ensuring that they're resourced well enough that they actually can do their jobs and that they're not just a fraction of something else, where they actually have the authority to do their jobs and they're not being overseen by an authoritarian system of another police service.
30 seconds, Mr. Dalton.
Okay, and So would a local, more diverse and more accountable policing oversight at the local level increase the accountability and trust of the community in the police?
I believe it would. I believe that there are some models of community engagement and oversight boards that do help. And I believe that some of them do have or ensure that there are Indigenous people engaged. So it helps people have confidence in the police services, and it helps to ensure that there is a healthy oversight within the system.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton. You'll have to open a separate chapter of ancestry.ca. With that, we'll have Mr. Lightbound. 4 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And I will echo my colleagues' comments. And I would like to underline the Louis Riel Day today, which is very much is of very much importance to Quebecers. My questions are for Professor Roach, and I will ask you my questions in French. I see that we should not underestimate. Follow up along the same lines, this trend. You have talked about the militarization of the RCMP and other policing forces, and I like the approach that you talk about professionalizing policing. Could you give us some examples of what you've noted on, be it here in Canada or abroad? And the second question I have for you is in regard to contract policing. In your opinion, what are the advantages? Could you please give us an overview? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lightbaum, for your questions. On the second, I mean, Surrey did a lot of work and found that by leaving contract policing, it would have its own police board where the mayor would be chair, and it could appoint people that represented the demographic diversity of Surrey. And it also found that it could hire, it would have much more flexibility in terms of hiring people, and there would not be this, 3-year cycle that a lot of RCMP officers will come into a detachment that perhaps is 1,000 or 2,000 miles away from their home, stay for 3 years, and move out. The disadvantage of exiting from contracting policing is that it requires obviously startup funds. And although Surrey is estimating that they will save money, that is in part based upon projections that the RCMP is due for a raise. And now that they have a union, they will probably get one. This was all done obviously before COVID. For your first question, I'm not sure I followed it exactly, but thank you for praising me for understanding French. I've tried throughout my career, but not with the greatest success. But the paramilitary, I think this goes back to the problem that my co-panelist has spoken about police officers experiencing sexism and racism within the ranks. One of the reasons why that festers is there's a hierarchical structure. And so the RCMP was not even based on Sir Robert Peel's model of a civilian police. It was rather based on the Irish Constabulary, which was a colonial occupying force within Ireland and wore the red because that is what the military wore. So I think that I agree with my co-panelists that the roots in the RCMP of paramilitarism run extremely deep. It runs from the start of the RCMP, and it's reinforced in Regina, where everyone trains, and it's reinforced within the command structure. And it will take a brave and inspired leader to really fight that. And we've had one civilian leader for the RCMP, and that didn't work out so well. So I think what you're seeing is that the institution and the paramilitarism of the institution is very durable.
Thank you, Mr. Lightbound. Madame Michaud, 1 minute, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to address a question to Ms. Omeniho. You said that Canada has a long history of racism against Indigenous women and Métis women. It is true. We don't need to say more about that. You say that women have never felt safe nor protected by police officers. This is a very serious problem. All Quebecers and Canadians, regardless of their origins, need to feel safe. In your opinion, what can be done to reestablish this trust between Métis women and police officers?
In my view, I believe that police officers need to look when they're dealing with individuals, and instead of seeing them first as a potential criminal, they need to hear their stories and be able to see what they can do and how they can address people. In a community, and I can give you, actually been a victim of violence, and they haven't been treated with the same values that maybe other racial people might have. And I'm not saying that I don't believe that there haven't been white people that have been victims of race, of issues with police. But in our community, far too often, there are women who do not get the same values or support when police are engaged. If they have mental health issues, they're treated really horrifically. Just last week was the video of an Indigenous woman having her clothes stripped off in a police station. And she was actually drunk and intoxicated, and they gave her a concussion and she had to go to the hospital. So those issues are real. They're not something that are just an obscure thing that's going on. It's just now with the new video cameras available, we're seeing this stuff on the media and being horrified by it, but it's the life that we experience. So
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Mr. Harris, final minute, please. And possibly Madame May, 1 minute after that, and then we'll have to close this session.
Mr. Roach, thank you, Chair. Mr. Roach, in making recommendations, you suggested that the Parliament ought to regulate police practices, including the use of force. Are you suggesting a standard that's in the criminal code or a standard that's in the RCMP Act that would go into contract policing, or exactly how should the legislation or Parliament regulate these national standards or outcomes?
I think it should be done through the criminal code, perhaps with regulations that have a standard as they have in the UK. In the golden strip search case, the Supreme Court practically begged Parliament to regulate strip searches. And we know that strip searches are a problem in some police forces and not in others. It should also be tied to collecting data. So in the UK, when you use a stop and search power, the police have to record when they did it, who they did it to, and those statistics are published.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Madame May, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given shortage of time, forgive me, Professor Roach, for not bothering to say how hugely I respect your work and how grateful I am to you. I want to go right to the CBSA officers.
Well, I mean, I think that you need to look at training. You need to look at create some sort of advisory board that would deal with people who are specialists with my Rcmp review body, which is already struggling.
Thank you, Madame May. Unfortunately, colleagues, that is where we are going to have to end this session. And on your behalf, I want to thank Professor Roach and President Omeniho for their contributions. As you can see from the questions, members really would like to be asking more questions, but we we unfortunately suffer the tyranny of time. With that, we will suspend and re-empanel.